Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this Ulster Society event organised by the Public Sector Committee. My name is Paula McCann and I'm a member of the Public Sector Committee. Today, I would like to welcome Leah Montgomery, Head of Economic Analysis and Business Case Unit in the Department of Health. Today, Leah will be sharing her experience and her expertise in the move to the 5-case model and the Better Business Cases NI, which is a very important topic in the public sector. I personally have found Leah and her team's expertise and guidance very useful when completing business cases in the past, and hopefully you'll find this session really beneficial today. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available to everyone after the event. If you have any questions, if you could put those questions in the question and answer section, and then we'll review the questions when we come to the end of Leah's presentation. I'll now pass you over to Leah to begin her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula, for that very kind introduction and those kind words. And thank you to everyone else for joining this afternoon's webinar, which is going to focus on Better Business Cases NI, the move to the 5-case model, how we reached that decision to move to the 5-case model and what it entails. So hopefully you find this afternoon's session beneficial and it meets your expectations. Okay, so just to begin, as Paula has said, my name is Leah Montgomery. I'm working in the Department of Health at the minute as head of the Economic Analysis and Business Case Unit. I previously worked in the Department of Finance as a departmental economist and have probably over 20 years experience in business cases and have obviously worked very closely with colleagues in the department to roll out the 5-case model within the Department of Health and its 16 arm's length bodies. Just to run through some housekeeping. So just as Paula has already said, if you can use the Q&A facility, it means we can record the questions and follow up on any questions that we're not able to answer during the session. You can also raise your hand or interrupt during the session if you can do that. Thank you for that. Okay, so the agenda, excuse me, is to give you a bit of background just on the 2019 review that was carried out by the Department of Finance, which ultimately led to the introduction of Better Business Cases NI. We'll talk about what do we mean by the 5-case model, and what does it entail, and I will do a quick comparison just of the old 10-step approach, which would have been made available through the Northern Ireland Guide to Expenditure Appraisal and Evaluation, on how that compares with the 5-case model. Towards the end of the session, then we'll point you towards some further guidance, other useful sources of information, and we'll finish off then with questions. Okay, so a bit of background just. There was an innovation lab that was held to really look at the sponsorship of arm's length bodies. As I said, the Department of Health has 16 arm's length bodies. Some of the other departments don't have any, or some just have 1 or 2. But most of our funding flows through those arm's length bodies, in particular the 5 health trusts. So the report basically that the Innovation Lab produced made a recommendation that there was a need to review and simplify the business case approvals process. There was a recognition, I suppose, that sometimes it can take too long and there is a perception that it's overly bureaucratic. Also then we had obviously the RHI inquiry, which revealed lots of deficiencies with the whole business case review and approvals process. And there was a need then for clarity in roles and responsibilities, which, as you'll see through the presentation today, it's all about getting the right people with the right skills to provide the right advice to, first of all, develop the business case in the first place, but then also to review and subsequently approve the expenditure decision at the end. There was also recognition that the culture surrounding business cases needed to change, that sometimes there's a perception that the business case is more of an obstacle than something that actually helps you make your decisions. And there was sometimes the effort that goes into developing the business case can be disproportionate and seem as overly time consuming. There was a need to move away from that culture and those perceptions. And also the bottom one, which I suppose was an important one for me, economists were very often seen as de facto approvers. So as I mentioned, I worked in the Department of Finance for about 15 years in the economics branch, and sometimes when the business cases came to me, I felt, I'm not quite qualified to sign off on all elements of this business case. But there was no process in place at that stage where you could go and seek advice from other areas. So yes, economists were looked at as the main approvers of the business case. So there's a need to move away from that because we don't have the expertise across all the areas. So the Department of Finance carried out a review of the expenditure approval and business case processes. It was endorsed by all the permanent secretaries across the departments and was published in 2019. The link, if you do get the slides after the session, will take you to an intranet, which you probably won't be able to access. So if you are interested in one, an electronic copy that can be provided. So the aims and objectives of that review. Well, as I say, it was to examine the business case and approvals process in Northern Ireland, consider the role of specialist advisors to ensure that business cases were fit for purpose, proportionate and clearly understood. So the Department of Finance, who undertook the review, they looked at culture within departments, in Department of Finance, in departmental finance divisions, looking at the roles, looking at the processes, how our business cases developed, how are they approved. It also looked at the existing business case guidance. It looked at clarifying the roles of economists and providing advice, particularly to overcome that problem or that perception that the economists were de facto approvers. So some of the main findings was that roles and responsibilities when providing advice to accounting officers needed to be clear. There needed to be more transparency and I think more guidance to those who were involved in the approvals process as to what their role was and what was expected of them. It's also important to recognise that business cases aren't approved because there are so many elements to a business case, and the business case doesn't just end when an approval is issued. So it is actually the expenditure that is approved. When that expenditure is approved, then the next bit is all around the project management and making sure that the project can be successfully delivered within that affordability envelope and within the conditions of the approval. So it's important to recognise that the business case is a live document that continues even after an approval is issued. As I said, and this is a key one for me, the business case is not a constraint. It shouldn't be viewed as something that holds you back or prevents you from doing something that's required. It is a tool that is designed to aid your decision-making process and ensure that the right decision is made and that it complies with managing public money principles and value for money regularity and all of that sort of thing. There's also a direct link between the business case process and project management assurance systems, especially the gateway review process, and we'll talk a wee bit about that as we go through the slides today. Okay, so there were 16 recommendations in total. You'll be glad I'll not be going through the 16 recommendations, but the first one is probably the one most relevant to today's session, which was that in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, we would adopt Treasury's best practice approach to the development of business cases, which is known as the 5-case model. So you'll see it there in the diagram. The 5 cases are made up of the strategic case, the economic, commercial, financial and management cases. The strategic one is the first part of the business case, and it's all about ascertaining the strategic fit and investigating the case for change, i.e. why does the government need to intervene here and why do we need to spend money on this proposal? The economic case then is looking at your various options, comparing those in terms of cost, benefits and risks and arriving at an option that offers the best value for money. The commercial case looks at how you're going to deliver the project. Is there a market out there that's capable of meeting your needs? And can you actually procure a viable solution? The financial case is around the accounting treatment and affordability. So it's looking at your cash flow statements, your budget statements, depreciation schedules, all of that sort of thing, to make sure that the project can be afforded. And the final one is the management case, looking at your project management arrangements, your project boards, your PIDs, your monitoring evaluation arrangements, benefits realization plans, risk registers, effectively all the things that project managers need to put in place to make sure that the project is ultimately a success. And we'll talk a wee bit more about the detail in each of those cases today. So in implementing that recommendation, there was a finance director letter issued in November 2020. Wasn't great timing, obviously, in the middle of a pandemic, but it could have been delayed to an undetermined date. So the Department of Finance decided to go ahead and publish it. And it was on that date, November 2020, that the 5-case model was officially launched in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. The business cases then had to be prepared under the 5-case model approach from the 1st of November 2020. And you see there the website for all the detailed guidance on better business cases NI, along with other key resources like NPC calculators and affordability spreadsheets. And there's also some supplementary guidance on that website, which was very useful. Okay, so just a couple of pointers. I've probably covered most of them already, but as I said, the business case is a living document. It doesn't really become expired or terminated until the project has been successfully delivered and you've completed your evaluation stage. It is a useful way of thinking through proposals in a very sort of structured and logical manner, so that you ultimately arrive at a value for money and affordable decision. It also helps you to make sure that you get the right outcome. So when you're looking at your objectives and you're establishing your benefits, ultimately you want to be thinking about what do I need to monitor and evaluate through the implementation of this project to ensure that it is a success and that I have proven that it was value for money. It's equally applicable when I say the business case process is equally applicable to policies, projects and programs, and it applies to all spending saving proposals, whether it's capital or revenue or a combination of both. I should also say here, because I'm not sure I'll cover it later on, but it's also applicable to contract extensions. I think somebody might have put something in the chat there. If it's a question, if you can maybe move it on to the Q&A facility, we'll pick it up there. Just the final point on that slide, proportionate effort is key. We get asked the question time and time again, well, what does that actually mean? It's all about looking at how much are you actually proposing to spend and how complex is your proposal. The greater the level of expenditure, the more complex your proposal, the more effort you're going to have to put into the business case, and probably the more substantial the document is going to be. If it's relatively low scale level of expenditure and it's not particularly complex, then you'll have a much shorter, sharper document. Okay, so the 5-case model, a couple of main points to note. The content is broadly the same as the 10-step approach, and I'll cover that in a minute. All new cases have to be completed under the 5-case model approach. The 5 cases should be presented as one business case. They're not distinct. There is interdependency between them, so that's why they all have to be presented at the same time. Each case should be signed off by the relevant expert with clear advice to the accounting officer. So ultimately, each expert under the 5 cases should be providing an assurance to the accounting officer that each of those cases stacks up and is robust. The SRO is responsible for the business case, essentially. They are the ones responsible for securing the right advice through the development of the business case, and they're the ones who should ultimately be signing off on the business case before it goes to the approving authority. And as I said, it doesn't mean 5 different business cases, thankfully. Okay, so just a comparison of the 5-case model and the 10-step approach. So your strategic case, as I said, is about establishing your strategic fit and looking at your need for government intervention. It also involves the establishment of your objectives and looking at any constraints that might hinder your ability to deliver on the objectives or meet the need that you've identified. So those 3 steps that we would have done previously are all feature in the strategic case under the 5-case model. Your economic case then, as I said, is about identifying, describing a long list of options, shortlisting those against the objectives and constraints and critical success factors, identifying the monetary cost benefits, risks, and non-monetary cost benefits and risks of each of the options, calculating your net present costs, considering sensitivity analysis if it's needed, and then ultimately drawing a conclusion around which of those options delivers the best value for money and meets the needs of the project. The commercial case then is looking at your arrangements for procurement. So we would expect to see things like a procurement strategy appended to the business case and your plans for ultimately procuring your project, whether it's a construction project or an IT project, or you're procuring a service. The financial case then looks at affordability and confirming the arrangements for funding. So is it a purely public sector funded project? Is a combination of public and private sector? Does it include third party or charitable donations and things like that? And the final case, the management case, then corresponds with step 9, of the previous 10-step approach. It's all about your arrangements for managing the project, delivering on benefits, monitoring evaluation, managing and mitigating your risks and so on. So I think it's really important to recognize that, because I think some people get a bit afraid of having to start a 5-case model business case when they've never done one before, but the content really is the same. It's just a slightly different way of presenting the information. Okay, so just to run through some of the main points. So down the left-hand side here, you'll have the different stages of a business case. We tend to incorporate stage 0 into stage 1 of your SOC, in the sense that it's really your strategic fit, your strategic context. But sometimes if the strategic assessment is done, then you will have a gate 0. So across here on the right-hand side, you'll have the corresponding gateway review stage. As you go through the various business case stages, you're ultimately covering what used to be the 10 you're covering the 10 steps of Better Business Cases NI. I don't tend to look at the 10 steps, but focus more on the actions. So when you're writing an SOC, you cover actions 1 to 8. When you're doing an OBC, it's actions 9 to 24, and an FBC will cover actions 25 to 35. Now, if you don't have to do an SOC, so if your project's not of sufficient value to require an SOC to be completed, you do a standalone OBC, which will cover actions 1 to 24 before you would obviously do your FBC post-procurement. The corresponding gates then, SOC stage, you would do your gate 1, which is your business justification. Is there sufficient justification to proceed with this project? Stage 2 is really your gate 2, your delivery strategy is all about, are you ready to proceed to procurement? And finally, your gate 3, your investment decision, is about, are we ready to award a contract for this project? Okay. So for those large projects, as I said, you might not have to do an SOC, OBC, FBC approach. It just depends really on the value and complexity of your project. If it's really high value, like over 50 million, then generally you are advised to go through the SOC, OBC, FBC approach. But also if your project or your proposal is novel, contentious, repercussive, or sets potentially expensive precedents, we would also advise you to go through this process. And what it allows you to do is basically have a check at an earlier point and to allow you to engage with your stakeholders at an earlier point before you commit resources and effort to develop something that perhaps might never materialize. And the level of detail required under each of the 5 cases changes as you move through the 3 stages. So at the opening, when you're starting your business case, the key like at an SOC stage, the main focus is on your SOC, or sorry, your strategic case, and you'll have some elements of the other four cases, sorry. Your economic case, there would be a reasonable amount of effort put in there, a level of detail, because you have to look at your options, and then you'd move on. Obviously, they would have less detail on the commercial, financial and management, because you haven't really considered all of your options in detail until you move through the OBC process. Okay, so I'll probably sort of duplicate some of what I've already said as I go through these slides, but the strategic case is linked to, down at the bottom there, the workshop one, which is your case for change. So Better Business Cases NI recommends that you use a workshop approach to develop your business case. So, and it also contains, the guidance contains advice on who you might include in each of the workshops to ensure that you gather the information required to develop the particular sections. So the strategic case is about looking at your alignment with existing policies and strategies, and making your case for change. So when we talk about the case for change, we expect you to look at or provide an explanation of existing arrangements. So how do we currently deliver this service, or what does our current IT system look like, for example? Then you talk about, well, what's wrong with what we currently do, and what is it we actually need to do? And then once you've sort of developed that and that process, it should help you to develop then your spending objectives. So when you've derived what you need to do, then you should set objectives that help you deliver on what is required. You would also provide the clarity on the scale and scope of the need. So, you know, how big does your hospital need to be? How many users are going to use the IT system that you're wanting to procure? You know, if it's a roads project, how busy is the road? You know, how many lanes does it need? You know, simple things like that. If it's a Department for Education project, how many pupils are there going to be in a school? You know, what's the catchments, you know, are there any other things happening in the area that might increase the number of applications to a particular school, and so on. And if you were doing an SOC at this stage, you would have take a high level look at your benefits, risks, constraints and dependencies. If you were doing a standalone OBC, you would consider your benefits, risks in more detail in that particular section of the OBC. And the relevant advisors in the strategic case are your policy leads and economists. Okay, moving on to the economic case then. The objective of the economic case is to identify the option that delivers the best value for money. Economists are the key source of guidance on this particular case. Once you've developed your spending objectives, you would also agree critical success factors. So what really do we need to provide for this project to be a success? What is absolutely essential, essentially? And then from your critical success factors and your spending objectives, you would determine a long list of options that are capable of meeting those objectives and critical success factors. We then perform a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats analysis. So previously and sometimes, you know, even in business cases that I see now, the approach is still to take your options and compare those against the objectives and the constraints, and do a bit of a sort of, you know, how well do the options deliver on the objectives and constraints, and then and shortlist your options that way. If you were doing an SOC, your last step or last action of the SOC would be to recommend a preferred way forward. So that's not your preferred option. That's more or less your shortlisted options that you would take forward into the OBC that are capable of meeting the objectives and meeting the need that you have established through the strategic case. A second workshop is recommended when developing the economic case. So that's getting all the people in the room, your service users and so on, to come in and help you to determine what options are available to you. You would also obviously include commercial expertise, procurement advisors, technical advisors if it's a digital project, for example. And just continuing on then, so if you had done your SOC and you were starting an OBC, then you would be starting at this stage in your OBC, which is determining your short list of options. I believe the Better Business Cases guidance recommends that you have at least 4 shortlisted options, which would be your status quo, your do minimum, and 1 or 2 other do something options. Now, some projects will have a lot more. Some might struggle to even derive 3 or 4 options, but you know, every case is different. But there's no, or the best advice I can give is probably don't try and produce options just for the sake of it, especially if they're not actually going to deliver on the objectives. So then take your shortlisted options. You derive the monetary costs and benefits for each of those and populate it into the NPC calculations to derive your net present costs for each of those options. You then do things like, could be impact statements or weighting and scoring methodology to assess the non-monetary benefits of each of those options, and then perform a risk analysis where you identify your risk, and you might use a sort of impact likelihood type scoring to the risks for each of the options. Once you've done all of that, then it's a matter of pulling all the information together on the options and selecting the one that you think is the best fit. And the workshop 3 recommended at this stage is about going through that process of shortlisting the options. So the third element of the 5-case model is the commercial case, and this is where we rely on our procurement advisors to provide the advice. So they will help you to determine the procurement strategy. They will look at the different service streams, what required outputs you need. And essentially what they are trying to do is to determine what your tender documentation needs to look like so that you actually deliver or get tenders in that will deliver the project or the requirement that you have. They will look at how you might apportion risk between, for example, the public-private sector, or the public sector and the bidders. I would look at different payment mechanisms. For example, you might have milestone payments during the construction of a project, and then if it was a private partnership, you might have an element of upfront payment and then ongoing revenue streams thereafter till the end of the contract. And they will really work through the contractual issues and ensure that tender prices are valid. And well, that's at FBC stage, but at this stage, they're really trying to provide you with advice on how you should approach the market. And the workshop then involving the procurement experts would be around developing the deals. Your financial case is where you bring in your financial advisors, your accountants, you guys effectively, to make sure that the costs that have been derived in the economic case have been subject to the correct accounting treatment. I'm not an accountant, obviously, but I've come across lots of little quirky things when it comes to the accounting treatment. You know, simple things like all training costs should be treated as revenue, the rules around capitalising salary costs, the obviously IFRS 16 and the implications that has had on our accommodation leases and so on. So we rely on you guys to make sure the accounting treatment of the costs that have been identified under the options is right, and also to check the cash flow, budget statements, inflationary assumptions, things like that, and then look for evidence that the capital and revenue costs can be afforded from within affordability envelopes or future budgets. The management case falls to the SRO, the senior responsible owner, and effectively the project team. So it's up to them to determine what it is they need to put in place to ensure that the project can be delivered successfully. They have to have obviously their project plans in place, any change management plans if it's a transformation type project, benefits realization plan, which focuses the attention on making sure that the benefits that you envisage actually materialize. The risk register, which allows you to keep a check on any risks that would hinder your ability to successfully deliver the project, making sure that those risks are allocated to the right people, and that mitigating actions are taken to minimise the impact of any risks arising. Then putting in place your monitoring and evaluation arrangements which will help the SRO project team to keep a focus on what it is they need to check that is happening through the implementation, through the procurement first of all, and then through the subsequent implementation of the project to ensure that it is successfully delivered in the end. There's a final workshop then at this stage, which looks at the successful delivery arrangements. So again, it's getting your project team, the people with those types of skills, successfully managing projects and so on, into a room to make sure that the boxes are ticked against those 5 actions. And then once you've concluded your procurement, you've got your approval for your OBC, and you go to procurement, you conclude your procurement, you've identified a preferred bidder. Your next stage, if it's a large project, obviously, a large procurement project, you would then complete your FBC, which is a record of the procurement process. How many bidders did you have? How did you evaluate the bids? How did you determine your preferred bidder, who you essentially want to award the contract to? The first step of your FBC is to revisit the case for change. Now, sometimes if there's been a significant gap between OBC and FBC stage, this section is very important in verifying that the case for change either remains unchanged. If it's worse, hopefully it hasn't got any worse, and sometimes it can get better. But it's all about making sure that what you're about to commit public funds to is still the right thing to do, that there's still a need for government intervention, and that the scale and scope of the tender that you're sitting with in front of you continues to meet the need that you've identified. You can look back at your OBC options, particularly if the case for change has changed. You might actually need to pull the plug on the tender, God forbid, pull the plug on the procurement process that you've just completed and maybe go back to the start. Doesn't happen very often, but I think with resource constraints and so on, it might be something that becomes more common than what we've seen certainly in the past. As I said, you describe the detail of the procurement process and how you evaluated the tenders. It looks at the deal, effectively what's involved in the tender and what the contractual arrangements are. It will consider the financial implications, confirm affordability, obviously based on a much more robust estimate at that stage, because you will have actual tender prices as opposed to estimates that we have at OBC stage. And then your final project management arrangements, which will essentially be an update of what you had at OBC stage, but provide much firmer details as to how you're going to monitor and manage the actual contract for delivering the project. Okay, so some of the key points. The SOC in years gone by was a very short document. It was very high level. Under the 5-case model, it's a much bigger beast and requires a much greater level of detail, particularly around the need and your objectives. At the minute in the Department of Health, an SOC is required for all expenditure decisions over 20 million. We are looking to increase that to 50 million in line with the DOF recommendation. An FBC is required for every project that essentially has a procurement. And the reason for doing that is because most approvals are given at OBC stage, but they will come with lots of conditions attached to them, conditions around the cost that has been approved or the level of expenditure that's been approved, the time frame for delivering the project, the scale and scope of the project, arrangements for evaluation and so on. And if any of those conditions are breached, then the FBC would be the document through which you would secure a revised approval before you enter into an irreversible commitment. Just the final point there, we've talked I talked briefly about the 5 workshops that coincide with the 5 cases. They're not always necessary. They should be undertaken with proportionate effort in mind. So obviously, you know, as a much smaller scale expenditure decision might be subject to more informal discussions rather than a formal workshop. But your larger projects, your big expenditure decisions, those over sort of, you know, 50 million should be subject to that workshop approach. But again, it's a case-by-case judgment, but they should always be seen to be adding value as opposed to a constraint. Proportionate effort and early engagement, you know, is priceless. You know, you just engage early with your stakeholders, engage early with the people who can provide you with advice, and engage early with the approving authority. Okay, so just to facilitate, I suppose, some of those smaller scale expenditure decisions, we have various business case pro formas that are available on the Better Business Cases NI website. You can see the values there. There are other business case pro formas for like office accommodation leases, proposals to engage external consultants. And as I said, they're just the business case pro formas are designed for all types of expenditure, capital, revenue, mixture of both, and all types of projects. Since Better Business Cases was launched, there has been the development of other business case pro formas. There's one for an SOC, there's now one for an FBC, there's evaluation pro formas, and there's also a pro forma for contract extensions. Okay, so just some pointers to further guidance. If you do get the slides here, you will be able to click on these hyperlinks that will take you directly to the guidance. So the first one is the overarching Treasury guidance on the project business case that provides you with all the details about a 100-page document, which you can just dip in and out of depending on what advice you need in which area. DOF published those the second and third guide themselves, which is the best practice guide and the plain English guide, which provides just sort of a snapshot of the different business case stages, and also provides clarity on the roles and responsibilities, which coincides with obviously making sure you're getting the right advice from the right expert. There's also summary guides to that SOC, OBC, FBC approach, which are similar to checklists, and a summary guide to the standalone OBC, which also provides some explanation of the role of workshops. The one at the bottom there, something that haven't quite touched on, but the FD letter, Finance Director letter that was published in 2015 provides advice and on the need for business cases to support all contracts, contract extensions, and procurement projects. So even if you've awarded a contract that has a 5+1+1 basis, you must always do a contract extension business case to justify your decision to pursue any of those optional extensions. Some other detailed guidance just on the gateway review process, which was issued under a DARE Accounting Officer letter. That should be available on the DOF website. There's other guidance on the Department of Health Internet, and you can access the approvals process for departmental expenditure on the DOF Better Business Cases website. Okay, those are just some contacts for myself and my colleagues. I would recommend probably if you wanted to take note of the generic mailbox would probably be the best way if you have any questions subsequent to today's session. Okay, so that concludes. Hopefully it's met your expectations and hopefully it's given you a flavour of what the 5-case model is all about. I'm just going to, first of all, check that chat. Yep. Just look at the Q&A.
Yeah, there's a few questions, Leah.
Yeah.
I suppose before we go to the questions, from my own experience, even lessons learned that maybe I could share from doing business cases, you highlighted the importance of having clear roles and responsibilities and having early engagement. And from my experience, I would say that's really key. You know, even reaching out to yourselves and getting your advice, and I suppose also looking regularly at those updates that are the templates that are on the websites are for updates because they can change. So from the outset, it's being aware of going back to those guidance and templates online to see if there's been any changes. I think was useful from my lessons learned, shall I say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, things do change, and we do get the every now and again some supplementary guidance, which we do try to circulate through circulars. But yeah, I would recommend Better Business Cases NI should be one of your favourites.
Yeah.
And access it regularly, as you say.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we'll go down through. There's a few questions here, Leah. So one of the questions was regarding the templates, regarding one of the attendees could only see templates up to 500k. So I think that's been highlighted through the session there, that there's templates over and above the 500k. So hopefully that has answered that question. There's another question here. When do you suggest PPEs are written? At the very end of the project or after, say, a year?
Yeah, I think, can we maybe start at the, where am I? I'm probably at the first question, and then we'll just work our way through it just in case we miss them. Is that okay? So looking at delegations, do you look at the economic case in the 5-case model and the MPV, or the financial case? It's based on the financial case. So it should be how much you want to spend that includes inflationary adjustments and optimism bias. So we would look at the affordability section for that one. Michael's asked a question about examples of actual business cases. We get that question asked probably, I don't know, once a week. We don't provide examples of business cases. Now, you will get examples on the internet, but the problem is you don't know if they're good, bad, or indifferent. So every case is different, and that's why we don't share examples, because you will find people start to copy and paste, and that's never a good idea. You're just better writing your own business case, tell your own story, basically, rather than looking at what somebody else has done. Hannah's asked a question about the tolerance on cost. So if you have been given approval to spend £10 million and you've identified maybe a change control or something different, something additional that you need to do, and it costs, £100,000, you should write a business case to justify that additional expenditure. So a short business case just to say that here's why we need to spend more money on this. But you don't need to get approval for that additional spend until you breach the percentage tolerance, which tends to be 10%. Okay, so let's say you got your business case approved, it's £10 million. You've done, that means you have £1 million of additional expenditure to incur before you need revised approval. However, if you have done, 15, changes each at £100,000 each, you've ultimately spent 1.5 million. You're outside your 10% tolerance. And if you need to seek revised approval, you're going to seek the approval by saying, here's our 15 individual small business cases that tells you why we've went above the 10% tolerance. So that's why it's important to always document your rationale and your decision making behind any additional expenditure, irrespective of whether it breaches the 10% tolerance or not. Joe, the templates, if you access the Better Business Cases NI website, you'll see that there will be other templates on there. So there is one now between 500,000 and 2 million. And as I've said, there's other templates like for SOCs and FBCs and so on. Joe had asked another question about the less complex projects. If you're procuring an audit service or new PC, what type of business case would you say that is? It's pre-procurement. So essentially anything pre-procurement is like an OBC or before you buy something. So not everything requires a procurement. It could be just a matter of buying something, but your OBC will justify that decision to either purchase something or procure it. And then after you've done that, your FBC is the document that that explains what happened. Did what you think you wanted to buy cost what you originally anticipated it would cost at OBC stage and so on. yeah, you've said you wouldn't normally revisit a business case after tendering. Well, hopefully I've changed your mind on that. But as I say, proportionate effort is key. I mean, if it's just a one-off purchase or something like that, or, you know, procuring a service, an external consultancy or something like that, you know, a couple of pages might be enough to document how you've decided to award a contract or go ahead with a purchase. PPEs, that's an interesting one. So somebody anonymously has asked, when do you suggest PPEs are written, at the very end of the project or after, say, a year? So this one is tricky because you will have different interpretations of the end of a project. So obviously with a construction project, you know, do you interpret the end of it being once the hospital, for example, is built and open and operational? So there's a couple of elements to it. You would do a PPE probably as soon as you've reached like project close. So the asset, for example, is ready for use. But very often what you'll have with an asset is a service that comes along with that. And so you should ultimately be reviewing the service provision element of your project at a later date. So it all very much depends on the project and when you're going to actually get value out of doing an evaluation. I would always suggest, you know, evaluating probably the upfront capital element of it. So the construction side of things, or if it's an IT system, you know, the development of the system before it goes live. But then a year after that, you would look at, well, how well is the system or the service working? Yeah, and then the question around total cost to determine which template you should use. Yeah, it should always be total cost basis that would include your capital and ongoing revenue costs. Your appraisal period obviously is important too. So your appraisal period will dictate the length of time over which you will calculate your costs. For a capital project, it tends to be dictated by the asset life. So if you're procuring an IT system, it will tend to be something like 7 years or 10 years. But it should be dictated by procurement advice, who will tell you what duration your contract should be. So that should match your appraisal period. For a construction project, obviously the asset could have a 50, 60-year life, but we recommend that you carry out your appraisal of costs and affordability over a 25-year period. For a service, we had something that's going to go on and on and on for forever. We would recommend a 10-year period for those. So you would calculate your total costs over those relevant timeframes, which should correspond with a contract period.
There's a further two questions there, Leah.
Yeah, so Joe has asked, templates question was about the different templates. Sorry, yeah, I've addressed that, I think. Diane, yeah, which is about IFRS 16. Yeah, hopefully I've touched on that, Diane. There is, you know, if as I said during the presentation, there's no point in developing options if they don't actually exist and they're not feasible. So if there is only one option, then you provide the justification through the business case. And obviously that justification should always be objective. So very often, you know, people think there's only one option because that's their preferred option. But you know, there is the need to consider alternatives if they exist, but don't give yourself work to do if they're not ultimately viable. Depreciation is a non-cash consideration, so it doesn't count towards the total cost or the delegated limit or really the affordability envelope. It's really just the capital and revenue side of things that you should be worried about, because they are actually cash requirements. Another question on IFRS 16. Mm-hmm. Is there any guidance in relation to the options in the service? Yeah. I think that's similar to the previous one around considering options. If there are a wide range of options, or is it just the one option, which is to renew a lease? I would say for leases, I would point you to the I rely on obviously our property management experts within the department. There will be the equivalent in other departments, so it's looking at, you know, those people who manage the estate basically to provide advice on the leases and whether or not a lease is better than a purchase or a new build option.
And I suppose, Leah, each case is different, so that's where the early engagement is really important. If you're unsure, if the guidance is unclear, it's really important to reach out to the likes of yourselves to get some clarity on some of those aspects so that you're doing it right from the outset, really, or, you know,
that's it.
I think that's key, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you are unsure, you start to write your options and you think, oh, I really only have one option. You know, ask somebody. Does this seem okay to you? Ask an expert first of all. Can you think of any other options? And then if it's something that's going to have to come through, say, for example, a department for approval, make sure you get their buy-in before you start writing a business case. And then at the end, we'll come back and say you have to include other options. So early engagement.
Save a lot of time, really.
And it's a case-by-case judgment, you know, include the options that are feasible. And you can include unfeasible or unrealistic options in a long list, but remove them from the short list through your sort of SWOT analysis and so on. At least it demonstrates that you've given consideration to other options, but you've ruled them out with sufficient and you know, reliable justification. Another anonymous one about the FBC. An FBC probably wouldn't be required for a low value business case, for example, less than 25k, simply because the advice is that you would go through the 3-stage process for large procurement projects. So something that's 25k is relatively low value. It's not likely to involve significant element of procurement. So you would only perhaps do an FBC if there was a further decision-making process, for example. Or if, I can't really, probably just if you needed a further approval, or you just wanted to have a document that justifies the decision that you took at that stage. Yes, Lisa, the templates are the same for both capital and revenue. That was an easy one to end with, thanks.
I suppose questions might come up when you are engaging in the business case process. So it's just reaching out to the likes of yourselves, Leah, just to get a bit of direction, I think is important, or the guidance firstly, I suppose, to see if that answers the questions. Just conscious of our time, it's near 2 o'clock and I'm sure everyone's eager to get back to the day job. Firstly, I'd like to thank Leah for coming to do this presentation today. I think it's been really useful, maybe as a recap, or it's new information for some of us today. Again, I would like to thank everyone for attending and asking relevant questions, which are really important because I'm sure everyone was wanting to probably ask the same question. There will be a survey that's getting circulated after this. So again, we'd be very grateful from the Public Sector Committee if you could complete that survey, and we'll take on board any feedback. There's going to be obviously future events. The next one that's organised by the Public Sector Committee is going to be on the 10th of May, and that is it's a breakfast seminar with the Finance Permanent Secretary, Neil Gibson, and that's in Chartered Accountants Ireland's office in Linen Hall Street. So look forward to seeing you all there, and there'll be emails going around with regards to the times and stuff. So again, I'd just like to thank you all for your attendance and hope you have a lovely afternoon and take care. Thank you.